Some people spend their entire lives searching for the moment that changes everything, never realizing that destiny often arrives disguised as an ordinary act of kindness on an ordinary night. 15 years before the nation watched a powerful businessman walk into a crowded courtroom with the weight of an empire resting on his shoulders, before headlines questioned whether everything he had built would disappear forever, there was only a freezing November evening in Chicago and a decision that made absolutely no sense to anyone who witnessed it. Cold rain swept across the city in steady waves, turning sidewalks into mirrors that reflected yellow streetlights and the distant glow of passing traffic. Black sport utility vehicles moved quietly through downtown under the watchful eyes of experienced security officers. Inside the lead vehicle sat Damian Ashford, a 47-year-old white Mafia boss whose influence stretched far beyond the luxury hotels, shipping companies, and charitable foundations that publicly carried his name. Those who worked for him respected his discipline. Those who competed against him respected his patience. Very few people truly knew the quiet loneliness that followed him home every evening after the meetings ended and the cameras disappeared. 15 years earlier, Damian had buried the only person who had ever reminded him that success meant nothing without compassion. Every Friday since his mother's passing, he followed the same routine without exception. He visited the small neighborhood church where she had anonymously funded free meals for struggling families, left fresh white lilies beneath a simple stained glass window she had loved, and drove home without speaking more than a few words. His advisors believed it was merely tradition. None of them understood it was the only promise he had never broken. As the convoy approached an aging church near the south side, Damian glanced absent-mindedly through the rain-covered window, expecting another quiet drive through streets most wealthy people no longer noticed. Instead, something stopped him cold. Beneath a cracked bus shelter stood a little black girl no older than 9. Her oversized hoodie was soaked through, her sneakers were held together with fading gray tape, and cold rain ran freely down her face. Yet she was not trying to protect herself. Kneeling beside a much younger homeless boy asleep on the concrete bench, she stretched her own worn jacket over his shoulders while leaving herself exposed to the freezing wind. Every passing car splashed water onto the curb. Every hurried stranger lowered their eyes and walked faster. Nobody stopped. Nobody asked whether the children had eaten. Nobody even looked at them long enough to remember their faces. Damian watched silently as the girl gently adjusted the jacket covering the sleeping boy before quietly rubbing warmth back into his tiny hands. There was no anger in her expression, no self-pity, only quiet determination. "Stop the car," Damian said. The driver hesitated for the first time in years. One security officer leaned closer. "Sir, this neighborhood has not been secured." Damian never looked away from the child outside. "Neither was mine when I was her age." The vehicles rolled to the curb. Umbrellas immediately surrounded Damian as security agents stepped into the rain first, scanning every direction with practiced precision. He ignored them and walked toward the bus shelter alone. The little girl immediately rose to her feet and instinctively stepped between the stranger and the sleeping child. She was trembling from the cold, yet she never moved aside. Damian noticed something that unsettled him more deeply than fear ever could. She believed protecting someone weaker than herself mattered more than protecting herself. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. "Nia," she answered. "Is that your little brother?" She shook her head. "No, sir." "Then why stay here with him?" She looked down at the sleeping child before answering, as though the question itself was strange. "Because when people wake up alone, they think nobody came back for them." The rain seemed to disappear beneath the weight of those words. Damian remembered another rainy night decades earlier when his own mother had found a frightened boy sitting outside a closed grocery store after everyone else had walked past. She had never offered him money first. She had offered him dignity. For the first time in 15 years, that memory returned with perfect clarity. One of Damian's advisors quietly approached from behind. "Sir, we are already running late." Damian remained silent for several long seconds. Then he slowly removed his leather gloves, knelt until he was eye level with the little girl, and noticed something almost hidden beneath the sleeve of her oversized hoodie. Around her wrist was a faded blue ribbon tied into a careful knot, old and weathered but still worn with obvious care. "Who gave you that?" he asked gently. Nia touched the ribbon without looking down. My mom. Where is she now? Nia smiled with heartbreaking calm. She told me that if I kept choosing kindness, one day somebody would remember me. Damien lowered his eyes. For a brief moment, he could not answer. He simply reached into his coat, removed his umbrella, and placed it over both children instead of himself. Rain immediately soaked his shoulders, but he did not seem to notice. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than anyone standing behind him had ever heard. Come with me. None of the people surrounding Damien Ashford understood why their employer had just invited two homeless children into his world. None of them realized that the smallest decision of his entire life had quietly become the first page of a story that would one day decide the fate of everything he had built. Ashford Manor stood behind towering iron gates on the northern edge of the city, where centuries-old oak trees shielded the estate from curious eyes, and the outside world felt impossibly far away. To most people, the mansion represented unimaginable wealth. To the employees who had devoted their lives to serving the Ashford family, it represented discipline, order, and routines that almost never changed. That was why every conversation stopped the moment Damien Ashford stepped through the front entrance with a rain-soaked little girl walking quietly beside him. Water dripped from the edge of Nia's oversized hoodie onto the polished marble floor as dozens of curious eyes followed her every step. Some employees looked surprised. Others looked concerned. A few quietly questioned whether bringing an unknown child into such an influential household could create problems no one had anticipated. Eleanor Whitmore, the estate manager who had faithfully protected Ashford Manor for more than 20 years, approached with her usual calm professionalism. Sir, should I contact emergency services or a children's shelter? Damien slowly removed his wet overcoat before answering. Neither. Eleanor waited respectfully. Then where would you like her to stay? Damien glanced toward the grand staircase that overlooked the entrance hall. Prepare the East guest room. A quiet murmur spread across the staff. The East guest room had always been reserved for family. One of Damien's senior advisors lowered his voice. Sir, perhaps we should verify her background before making permanent arrangements. Damien looked at him without raising his voice. Did anyone verify mine before my mother opened her front door to a frightened boy many years ago? The room became completely still. Nobody spoke another word. While housekeepers hurried upstairs to prepare the room, a young chef quietly placed a bowl of hot tomato soup and fresh bread on the dining table. Nia looked at the meal but did not immediately sit down. Instead, she turned toward the entrance where the little homeless boy remained wrapped inside a warm blanket provided by the security team while social workers were contacted to reunite him with surviving relatives. May I take half of my dinner to him? She asked softly. The chef smiled kindly. There is plenty for both of you. Nia shook her head. He always wakes up hungry. Damien watched the exchange without saying anything. He had seen executives negotiate billion-dollar contracts with less honesty than a child who believed sharing mattered more than eating first. Later that evening, Eleanor gently guided Nia upstairs and opened the door to a quiet bedroom overlooking the gardens. Fresh towels rested neatly beside a warm bath. Clean clothes had been carefully folded across the bed, and a small night lamp cast a soft golden glow through the room. Nia stepped inside very slowly, almost afraid to touch anything. She quietly thanked Eleanor before asking a question that caught the older woman completely off guard. Will someone else need this room tomorrow? Eleanor smiled. No, sweetheart. It is yours. Nia lowered her eyes. For how long? Eleanor hesitated. She had managed the estate for decades, yet no child had ever asked that question before. As long as you need it. Nia nodded politely, but after Eleanor left, she carefully placed her old backpack beside the bedroom door instead of unpacking it. She lined up her worn sneakers neatly against the wall and folded her hoodie into a perfect square on top of the backpack. In her mind, people who lived on the streets never unpacked completely because tomorrow could always mean leaving again. Long after midnight, Damien walked quietly through the upstairs hallway on his way to the library. As he passed the guest room, he noticed a thin line of light beneath the door. Curious, he looked inside. Nia was not asleep. She was sitting on the floor beside her backpack with a small notebook resting across her knees. Using a short pencil worn almost to its end, she carefully wrote 3 simple sentences before closing the notebook and placing it back inside the bag. Damien did not interrupt her. After she finally fell asleep, he entered the room silently and noticed the notebook partially visible inside the open backpack. He never believed in invading another person's privacy, yet one sentence written across the page caught his attention before he could look away. It read, "If I am kind tomorrow, maybe they will let me stay one more day." Damien quietly closed the notebook exactly where he had found it. Standing alone in the dark room, he realized the greatest fear carried by the little girl sleeping peacefully beneath a warm blanket was not hunger or cold. It was believing that kindness had to be earned every single morning just to deserve a place in the world. The next day, without telling anyone why, Damien instructed the carpenter to remove the lock from the guest room door. "No child in this house," he said softly, "should ever wonder whether she belongs behind a locked door again." The first few months inside Ashford Manor felt less like finding a home and more like borrowing one. Every morning before sunrise, Nia quietly folded her blanket with military precision, placed her shoes beside the bedroom door, and made certain her backpack remained packed exactly as it had been on the rainy night she arrived. She never filled the dresser drawers. She never placed her notebook on the desk permanently. She never believed tomorrow belonged to her. Eleanor noticed these small rituals long before anyone else did, but Damien noticed something even more heartbreaking. Every evening, after dinner, Nia quietly washed her own plate before anyone could stop her. One night, Damien walked into the kitchen to pour himself a cup of coffee and found the little girl standing on a wooden stool, carefully drying dishes almost twice her size. "Who asked you to do this?" he said. Nia looked down, suddenly worried she had made a mistake. "Nobody, sir." "Then why are you working?" She answered without hesitation. "Because people keep the children they do not regret." Damien stood silently for several seconds. Those words followed him long after he left the kitchen. The next morning he instructed every employee that Nia was never to be given household duties unless she specifically volunteered, but he never told her about the order. He wanted kindness to feel like freedom, not charity. Winter slowly gave way to spring. Tutors began arriving each weekday, introducing Nia to books she had never imagined existed. Reading came naturally. Mathematics fascinated her. History made her ask endless questions. Yet writing remained difficult. Every essay returned covered with careful corrections. One afternoon, after receiving another disappointing grade, Nia quietly thanked her teacher, carried the papers upstairs, and closed her bedroom door. She did not cry where anyone could see her. Instead, she erased every mistake one sentence at a time before starting over from a blank sheet of paper. When Eleanor entered later that evening with warm cookies, she found dozens of crumpled pages scattered across the floor. "You have worked enough for today," Eleanor said gently. Nia shook her head. "Not yet. Mr. Ashford believed I could learn. I have not earned that belief today." Eleanor knelt beside her and carefully smoothed one of the wrinkled pages. "Do you know what he admires most?" Nia looked up hopefully. "Perfect people." Eleanor smiled. "No, people who refuse to quit." Those words stayed with Nia long after the lesson ended. Months later, Damien happened to return home early from a business meeting. Crossing the library, he noticed a small lamp still glowing beneath one of the reading tables. Hidden behind a stack of oversized dictionaries sat Nia, sound asleep with an open grammar workbook beneath her cheek and a sharpened pencil still resting between her fingers. Several handwritten pages covered the table, each one showing the same paragraph rewritten over and over until every sentence flowed naturally. Damien quietly picked up the top sheet. The final line read, "A person who is given hope should learn how to give hope back." He folded the paper carefully and placed it exactly where he had found it before removing his suit jacket and gently laying it across her shoulders. He left the room without waking her. The following week, the writing teacher returned every assignment with a bright red letter A at the top. Nia smiled politely but never celebrated. She simply thanked her teacher and asked for another book. Life inside the mansion gradually settled into peaceful routines, yet one question continued following Damien everywhere he went. Late one evening, his longtime attorney, Charles Bennett, joined him in the library after reviewing several estate documents. As they discussed future planning, Charles paused before asking quietly, "Have you considered adopting her legally?" Damien stared into the fireplace without answering. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, he spoke so softly that only Charles could hear. Every person connected to my name inherits my enemies. Charles waited. Damien continued. If she becomes my daughter on paper, one day she may pay for choices she never made. He closed the file in front of him. I would rather let her believe I kept my distance than watch my world steal her future. Upstairs, completely unaware of the conversation taking place below, Nia carefully untied the faded blue ribbon around her wrist before placing it inside the small wooden memory box Damien had quietly given her on her 10th birthday. Resting beside it was a folded note she had written to herself months earlier. It contained only one sentence. Someday, I will become someone he never has to worry about again. Time has a quiet way of changing people without asking permission. 6 years passed like falling snow across the gardens of Ashford Manor, covering old footprints while leaving the deepest memories untouched. The frightened little girl who once believed she had to earn another night's shelter had become a young woman whose determination impressed every teacher she met. At 18, Nia received acceptance letters from several respected universities, each recognizing her remarkable academic record and relentless work ethic. When the envelopes arrived at Ashford Manor, Eleanor celebrated with tears of joy, and the kitchen staff prepared her favorite dinner without being asked. Damien simply placed the letters on the library desk beside a cup of hot tea and said, "Choose the place that challenges you the most." Nia looked at him with quiet surprise. "Not the safest one." Damien slowly shook his head. Comfort rarely teaches anything worth remembering. She accepted a scholarship to a prestigious law school in Boston, nearly 1,000 miles from Chicago. The night before she left, she stood alone in the guest room that had long ago become her own. For the first time since arriving at Ashford Manor, she unpacked every drawer completely before carefully packing everything again into 2 suitcases. She smiled to herself, realizing she was no longer packing because she expected to be sent away. She was packing because she finally had somewhere worth returning to. Early the next morning, Damien personally drove her to the airport. The journey lasted almost an hour, yet neither of them filled the silence with unnecessary conversation. As the terminal came into view, Damien reached into the back seat and handed her the small wooden memory box she had treasured since childhood. "Keep it," he said. "Dreams grow heavier with time. They deserve a stronger place to rest." Nia held the box carefully in her lap before asking the question she had rehearsed in her mind for weeks. "Will I still have a room at the manor?" Damien kept his eyes on the road. "As long as I am alive, you will never have to ask that question again." She quietly turned toward the window so he would not see the tears gathering in her eyes. Boston was everything she expected and far more difficult than she imagined. Law school demanded endless reading, sleepless nights, and relentless competition. For the first time in years, Nia found herself surrounded by students who had grown up with every educational advantage she had never known. During her first semester, she failed one of her most important legal writing examinations. The grade sat in front of her like a personal betrayal. She walked across campus in freezing rain that evening, carrying the paper inside her backpack while wondering whether she truly belonged there. More than once she reached for her phone, wanting to call Damien, but each time she stopped herself. She remembered his words on the day she left. Comfort rarely teaches anything worth remembering. Instead of asking for help, she found a part-time evening job in the university law library, organizing old case files until midnight in exchange for tuition assistance and access to archived legal materials after closing. While other students hurried home, Nia remained among shelves filled with forgotten court records, teaching herself how tiny details hidden inside old documents could completely change the outcome of complicated legal disputes. Months later, she retook the same examination and earned one of the highest scores in her class. She never mentioned the earlier failure to anyone. Back in Chicago, life at Ashford Manor continued quietly. Every Christmas, a handwritten card arrived from Boston. Every birthday, another letter appeared inside Damien's study, always ending with the same sentence. "Thank you for believing in tomorrow before I could see it." Damien never wrote long replies. Sometimes he mailed only a single book with a short note inside the cover. Sometimes he simply sent fresh photographs of the gardens in spring. Yet after every letter arrived, he carefully placed it inside the bottom drawer of his desk instead of throwing it away. Eleanor noticed the growing stack year after year, but never commented. Then one autumn evening, She entered the library carrying tea and found Damien reading every birthday card Nia had ever sent. He quietly returned them to the drawer before closing it with unusual care. Eleanor smiled gently. "You miss her?" Damien looked toward the empty chair across the room where Nia had once spent countless evenings studying. After a long silence, he answered with complete honesty. "Every parent does. Some of us simply learn to miss people without telling them." By the time Nia graduated from law school with honors, Damien Ashford had quietly reached an age where victories no longer felt as satisfying as responsibilities felt heavy. The empire he had spent decades building employed thousands of families across the country. Every payroll represented mortgages, college tuition, medical bills, and dreams belonging to people who would never know the countless sleepless nights required to keep those promises alive. To the public, Damien remained composed, confident, and untouchable. Only Eleanor noticed that he had begun arriving at the library before sunrise instead of after breakfast. More mornings than not, she found a fresh cup of coffee growing cold beside unopened financial reports while Damien stared through the tall windows overlooking the gardens without reading a single page. The weight he carried had changed. Years earlier, he had worried about growing his empire. Now he worried about protecting the people whose lives depended upon it. Meanwhile, Nia accepted a position at one of Boston's most respected corporate litigation firms. She intentionally declined several offers promising larger salaries because she wanted experience instead of prestige. Senior partners quickly discovered that while younger attorneys rushed toward dramatic courtroom arguments, Nia quietly disappeared into archives, handwritten records, and forgotten legal filings that others considered unimportant. "Cases are rarely won by the loudest argument," one retired judge told her during a mentorship program. "They are won by the document everyone else stopped reading." Those words became part of her daily routine. Every evening after work, she remained inside the firm's document repository, studying historical corporate disputes, authentication procedures, and preservation laws governing original financial records. During one internship assignment involving a nonprofit organization, she unexpectedly reviewed decades-old archival storage procedures funded years earlier by the Ashford Foundation. Buried among thousands of preservation logs, she noticed something unusual. One collection of certified corporate archive records had been duplicated and independently preserved under a legal compliance program created long before digital storage became common practice. Most attorneys would have ignored the discovery because the records appeared unrelated to any active case. Nia requested certified preservation copies anyway, believing complete records should never be discarded simply because they seemed unimportant. She stored them securely and eventually forgot about them as new cases filled her schedule. Nearly 4 years passed before those forgotten documents would matter. Back in Chicago, subtle changes continued unfolding around Damien. Longtime business partners who had once called him every week suddenly communicated only through lawyers. Routine financial audits became unusually detailed. Anonymous requests for corporate records increased month after month. During one executive meeting, Damien quietly noticed 2 board members avoiding eye contact whenever certain subsidiaries were discussed. He said nothing, but his instincts, sharpened by decades of leadership, recognized the unmistakable feeling that someone had been building a case against him for a very long time. One rainy evening, almost exactly 15 years after Nia had first entered Ashford Manor, Damien remained alone inside the library studying financial reports while rain tapped gently against the tall windows. Eleanor entered carrying fresh coffee before noticing several unopened letters resting beside his desk. "You have not opened these," she observed. Damien looked at the envelopes. Each contained requests from government investigators seeking historical financial records dating back more than a decade. "Some storms announce themselves long before they arrive," he said quietly. "You only recognize them when you finally hear the thunder." Eleanor watched him carefully. "Are you worried?" Damien smiled faintly, though it never reached his eyes. "Not for myself." He rested his hand upon a framed photograph showing every employee gathered outside Ashford Manor during the previous Christmas celebration. "If I fall, thousands of innocent people will lose much more than a company." The following morning, National news networks interrupted regular programming with breaking reports announcing a sweeping federal civil investigation involving several prominent corporations suspected of financial misconduct. Damien Ashford's companies appeared among the organizations named in the filings. Within hours, investors reacted, business channels broadcast endless speculation, and reporters crowded outside corporate headquarters searching for comments. Lawsuits quickly followed. Financial institutions temporarily suspended major transactions, while regulators requested extensive documentation covering events from nearly 15 years earlier. Damien assembled the finest legal team available, yet after several exhausting weeks, even his experienced attorneys delivered difficult news. "Someone has spent years constructing this case," his lead counsel admitted. "They are relying on records that appear authentic. If we cannot locate the original certified archives, proving alterations may become almost impossible." Damien slowly closed the thick case file in front of him. For the first time in many years, he realized that preparation alone might not be enough. Hundreds of miles away in Boston, Nia glanced at a breaking news alert flashing across her computer screen. She froze as Damien's photograph appeared beneath the headline. Her heart sank, not because she believed the accusations, but because one forgotten shelf inside an old archive suddenly returned to her memory with perfect clarity. 3 weeks later, the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago became the center of national attention. Satellite trucks lined the surrounding streets before sunrise. Reporters rehearsed opening statements beneath bright camera lights, and financial analysts confidently predicted that Damien Ashford's reputation would never recover. Inside the courthouse, however, the atmosphere felt less dramatic and far more exhausting. Hundreds of pages of legal filings covered every available table, while attorneys hurried through narrow hallways carrying boxes of evidence accumulated over months of investigation. Damien arrived quietly through a private entrance with his legal team. He wore the same dark navy suit he reserved for the most difficult moments of his life. Yet Eleanor immediately noticed something different. The silver streaks in his hair seemed brighter beneath the courthouse lights, and the calm confidence that had once entered every room before he did had been replaced by a heavier silence. He no longer carried the burden of protecting only himself. He carried the futures of thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended upon the outcome of the proceedings. As the first hearing began, the government attorneys carefully presented a detailed timeline supported by financial records, archived approvals, and internal authorization forms appearing to connect Damien's signature to transactions dating back nearly 15 years. Every document looked authentic. Every date appeared consistent. Every chart seemed meticulously organized. Damien listened without interruption, occasionally leaning toward his attorneys to ask short questions, but deep inside he recognized something deeply unsettling. Several approval numbers displayed on the courtroom monitors did not match the sequence he remembered personally reviewing years earlier. The signatures looked identical to his own, yet tiny formatting differences disturbed him. When court recessed for lunch, Damien quietly gathered his notes while his lead attorney approached with visible concern. "They have built a stronger case than we anticipated," he admitted. "Without the original certified archives, proving these records were altered will be extraordinarily difficult." Damien looked toward the nearly empty courtroom before answering. "Truth does not disappear simply because we cannot reach it today." His attorney nodded respectfully, although neither man knew where that truth might still exist. Nearly 1,000 miles away in Boston, Nia sat alone inside her office reviewing every public filing she could legally obtain. As page after page appeared across her computer screen, a single reference number caught her attention. It matched an archival preservation code she had encountered years earlier while working late inside the document repository. She immediately unlocked a secure storage cabinet containing several certified preservation copies she had requested during her internship. One by one, she compared the archived originals against the publicly filed records now being used in court. Her heartbeat quickened. The approval numbers were different. Several dates had been modified. Entire authorization pages had been reformatted years after the originals had been preserved. She checked again, unwilling to trust her first impression. The differences remained. Instead of rushing toward the courthouse, Nia spent the next 48 hours verifying every discovery through proper legal channels. She contacted the independent archival repository responsible for preserving the original records, requested certified authentication certificates, and arranged for digital integrity reports confirming that the preservation files had remained untouched since their original submission years earlier. Every request followed established legal procedures because she understood that accurate evidence mattered only if the court could trust how it had been obtained. Meanwhile, the second day of hearings proved even more difficult for Damien's legal team. Motions were denied, procedural objections failed, and the opposing attorneys continued strengthening their presentation while reporters confidently described the case as moving steadily against Ashford. Late that afternoon, Damien remained seated alone inside the nearly empty courtroom after everyone else had left. He looked across the polished wooden benches where countless strangers had spent 2 days quietly judging a lifetime of decisions they could never fully understand. For the first time in many years, uncertainty found its way into his thoughts. Perhaps protecting others sometimes meant accepting losses no preparation could prevent. At that very moment, the heavy courtroom doors opened quietly. A young black attorney entered carrying a single leather briefcase and several carefully organized archival binders. She walked with calm purpose toward the clerk's office instead of the crowded press area, formally submitting a motion requesting limited intervention as an independent custodian of newly authenticated documentary evidence directly relevant to the disputed financial records before the court. The clerk accepted the filing, stamped the documents, and informed her that the judge would review the request before the following morning's session. Nia thanked the clerk politely before turning toward the silent courtroom. Across the room, Damien briefly looked up from his papers. Their eyes met for only a second before he returned to reading, never realizing that the young attorney standing quietly beneath the courtroom lights had once been the little girl who believed kindness had to be earned one day at a time. The following morning, the courtroom filled earlier than usual. Word had quietly spread through legal circles that an independent attorney had filed an unusual motion supported by newly authenticated archival evidence. No one knew whether the judge would allow it. Reporters whispered to one another while adjusting cameras, uncertain whether the filing represented a desperate delay or a genuine turning point. Damien entered with the same measured composure he had maintained throughout the proceedings, but Eleanor noticed he had barely touched the breakfast placed outside his study before leaving Ashford Manor. For the first time since she had known him, she sensed not fear but disappointment. He was preparing himself for the possibility that truth alone might not be enough if it arrived too late. When the session began, the judge reviewed several procedural matters before turning toward the newly filed motion. "Counsel for the independent petitioner," he said, "please approach." Nia stood, buttoned her navy jacket, and walked toward the lectern with calm confidence. She did not hurry. She did not perform for the courtroom. Every step reflected years of discipline rather than ambition. "Your Honor," she began, "I am not asking this court to accept my conclusions. I am only asking the court to examine original certified records that neither party has previously presented." Before she could continue, the opposing attorneys immediately objected, arguing that the evidence fell outside the existing discovery schedule and should therefore be excluded. One attorney confidently stated that allowing additional documents at this stage would unfairly disrupt months of preparation. The judge listened carefully before looking back toward Nia. "Why were these records not produced earlier?" he asked. Nia answered without the slightest hesitation. "Because neither party knew they existed. They were preserved independently under a historical compliance program established years before this litigation began. I located them during unrelated archival research several years ago and lawfully obtained certified preservation copies long before this case was ever filed." The judge leaned forward with obvious interest. "Can you establish an unbroken chain of custody?" Nia placed a neatly organized binder onto the evidence table. "Yes, Your Honor." Inside were preservation requests, repository certifications, digital integrity reports, and sworn affidavits documenting every transfer from the original archive to the secured storage facility where the records had remained untouched. Rather than arguing emotionally, she allowed the documents to tell their own story. The judge spent several minutes reviewing the certifications before speaking again. "The court will permit a limited evidentiary hearing for the sole purpose of determining authenticity." A quiet wave of surprise moved through the courtroom. It was not a victory. It was simply permission to continue. Yet for Damien's legal team, it represented the first meaningful opportunity they had received since the case began. During the hearing, Nia called the director of the Independent Archival Repository, who explained how the preservation system had been created nearly 2 decades earlier to protect original corporate records from accidental loss or unauthorized alteration. Every document deposited into the repository received a permanent authentication code, secure preservation timestamp, and continuous audit history that could not be modified without leaving a permanent record. The witness answered each question carefully, avoiding exaggeration and remaining strictly within the documented facts. The opposing attorneys attempted to challenge the reliability of the archive, suggesting that duplicate records might not accurately reflect the originals. Nia never interrupted. When cross-examination concluded, she calmly requested permission to present the repository's digital audit log. Large courtroom monitors displayed every recorded interaction involving the preserved files over the past 15 years. The timeline revealed something remarkable. The certified archival copies had remained completely unchanged from the day they were deposited, while several publicly filed records introduced during the investigation showed revisions created years later. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter as page after page appeared side by side. Dates no longer matched. Authorization sequences had shifted. Paragraph formatting differed in ways invisible to ordinary readers, but unmistakable to forensic document specialists. Even Damien's lead attorney slowly lowered his pen, realizing he was watching evidence none of them had believed still existed. The judge looked toward the government attorneys. Does the prosecution dispute the authenticity of the preservation audit? After a brief conference among themselves, the lead attorney answered carefully. At this time, Your Honor, we request an opportunity for independent forensic examination before offering a final position. The judge nodded. Granted. Instead of ending the matter, he appointed a court-approved forensic document laboratory to compare every challenged record with the newly submitted originals before the next hearing. As people slowly began leaving the courtroom, reporters who had expected dramatic arguments instead found themselves describing something far more powerful. For the first time since the proceedings had begun, the case was no longer being driven by assumptions. It was being guided by verifiable truth. Damien remained seated for several quiet moments, watching the young attorney organize every document with the same careful precision she had displayed throughout the day. Something about the familiar way she straightened each page before closing the binder stirred a memory just beyond his reach, one that refused to reveal itself but somehow felt as though it had been waiting for him all along. 3 days later, the courtroom felt less like a battlefield and more like a place where patience was slowly uncovering the truth. Every seat remained occupied long before the judge entered. Reporters no longer whispered about the collapse of Damien Ashford's empire. Instead, they waited to see whether the independent forensic examination would confirm what the newly discovered archival records had already begun to reveal. Damien sat quietly beside his attorneys, his hands resting calmly upon the polished wooden table. He had learned long ago that there were moments when speaking accomplished nothing. Across the room, Nia carefully arranged her binders in perfect alignment before placing the small brass key hanging around her neck beneath her blouse, just as she had done every morning since leaving Ashford Manor years earlier. She never considered it lucky. It simply reminded her that gratitude should be carried, not displayed. The judge entered, and the courtroom immediately stood before settling into complete silence. The court-appointed forensic examiner approached the witness stand and presented the findings with remarkable precision. Independent analysis confirmed that the preservation copies submitted by Nia had remained completely unchanged since their original certification nearly 15 years earlier. More importantly, the examination identified multiple formatting revisions, altered authorization sequences, and reconstructed approval pages inside several documents that had formed the foundation of the allegations against Damien. The examiner made no accusations. He simply explained the science. Every conclusion rested upon verifiable digital history rather than personal opinion. When his testimony concluded, The judge carefully reviewed the report before announcing that significant portions of the previously submitted documentary evidence would no longer be treated as reliable until their authenticity could be fully established. The atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted immediately. It was not celebration. It was relief. The weight of certainty had finally been replaced by the possibility of justice. During a short recess, Damien remained seated while most attorneys gathered in small groups throughout the hallway. Eleanor quietly approached him carrying a fresh cup of coffee. Before handing it to him, her eyes drifted toward Nia, who was standing near a window carefully folding a white handkerchief before placing it inside her briefcase. Eleanor suddenly stopped walking. That small, deliberate habit had not changed in 15 years. As a little girl, Nia had folded every blanket, every towel, every piece of clothing with the same careful movements, believing that taking care of borrowed things was another way of thanking the people who had trusted her. Eleanor watched for another moment before her eyes settled upon the thin silver chain now visible above Nia's collar. Hanging from it was the familiar brass key Damien had given a lonely child on her 10th birthday together with a small wooden memory box. Eleanor felt her breath catch. There could not be two keys like that. She slowly walked toward the young attorney. "Excuse me," she said gently. Nia turned and smiled with the same quiet warmth Eleanor remembered from years ago. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor's voice trembled slightly. "May I ask where you found that key?" Nia instinctively touched the necklace before answering. "It was a birthday gift from someone who changed my life." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Nia?" For the first time since arriving at the courthouse, the confident attorney disappeared, replaced for just a heartbeat by the little girl who had once stood in the entrance hall of Ashford Manor asking how long she would be allowed to stay. "Miss Eleanor," she whispered. Without another word, Eleanor wrapped her arms around her. Several nearby attorneys paused, quietly stepping away as they sensed they were witnessing something deeply personal. Damien looked up from across the courtroom, puzzled by the unexpected embrace. As the recess ended, everyone returned to their seats. Before the judge resumed the proceedings, Eleanor leaned close to Damien and spoke so softly that no one else could hear. "It is her." Damien frowned slightly. "Who?" Eleanor glanced toward Nia, the little girl from the bus shelter. Damien looked across the courtroom once more. This time he did not see only a gifted attorney. He noticed the careful way she straightened every document before handing it to the clerk. He noticed the calm patience in her eyes. Then his gaze settled upon the small brass key now resting against her navy jacket. Suddenly, the years disappeared. He remembered a frightened child carrying a worn backpack, a notebook filled with hopeful sentences, a blue ribbon tied around a tiny wrist, and a promise he had made that she would never have to wonder where she belonged again. His eyes closed for only a moment as every forgotten memory returned with astonishing clarity. When the hearing concluded later that afternoon and the courtroom slowly emptied, Damien quietly waited beside the courtroom doors until Nia approached. Neither of them spoke immediately. Some reunions deserve silence before words. Finally, Damien smiled with unmistakable warmth and said the words he had unknowingly carried inside his heart for 15 years. "Welcome home, Nia." She looked at him with tears shining in her eyes and answered softly, "I never stopped believing I already had one." Several weeks later, after every forensic review had been completed and every remaining procedural question had been answered, the court delivered its final decision. The judge explained that the authenticated archival records, supported by independent forensic analysis and a verified chain of custody, demonstrated that the disputed documents could no longer be relied upon as accurate representations of the original corporate history. Without those records, the central claims against Damien Ashford could not be sustained. The courtroom remained completely still as the ruling echoed through the chamber. There were no dramatic celebrations, no raised voices, only a long, quiet breath shared by people who had spent months waiting for truth to be heard. Reporters rushed toward the courthouse entrance, eager to broadcast the outcome across the country. Cameras flashed as Damien stepped outside, but instead of delivering a triumphant speech, he simply thanked the judge, acknowledged the professionalism of every attorney involved, and reminded the gathered journalists that justice was strongest when it was built upon facts instead of assumptions. Then he walked away. The headlines the following morning surprised many readers. They did not focus on scandal. They focused on integrity, authenticated evidence, and the quiet attorney whose careful work had changed the course of an entire case. Yet Nia accepted no television interviews and declined every invitation to discuss her role publicly. She believed that the truth had already spoken loudly enough. 2 days later, Damien invited her back to Ashford Manor. As the familiar iron gates slowly opened, memories returned with every turn of the winding driveway. The gardens were even more beautiful than she remembered. The old oak trees had grown taller. Fresh, white lilies still rested beneath the portrait of Damien's mother in the library exactly as they had every Friday for the past 15 years. Some promises, she realized, never grow old. Every employee gathered quietly inside the entrance hall. The gardeners, the cooks, the drivers, the housekeepers, the security officers, and the office staff welcomed her not as a guest, but as someone whose place had never truly disappeared. Eleanor embraced her once again before smiling through happy tears. "You always said kindness would bring you back someday," she whispered. Nia smiled gently. "I just never knew it would bring me home." That evening, Damien asked everyone to join him in the library. The room was filled with warm light from the fireplace, and the familiar scent of old books carried the comfort of countless quiet evenings shared across the years. Damien stood beside the large oak desk and carefully unfolded a handwritten letter. "There is something I should have done a long time ago," he began. He looked toward Nia with unmistakable pride. "Years ago, people asked me why I never adopted you. The answer was simple. I believed keeping you away from my name would protect your future. I wanted you to build a life that belonged entirely to you, not to my reputation or my mistakes." He paused before continuing. "Today I finally understand that family is not created by legal documents. It is created by the people who choose each other again and again, even after life takes them in different directions." He handed her the letter. It was not a contract, nor a legal declaration. It was a personal promise stating that Ashford Manor would always be her home, and that the Ashford Foundation would establish a new program called the First Night Initiative, providing shelter, education, legal support, and long-term opportunities for homeless children across the country. At the bottom of the page, beneath Damien's signature, were simple handwritten words. "Because one child changed an entire house." Tears filled Nia's eyes as she looked around the room. She remembered arriving with a worn backpack, believing every sunrise might be her last beneath that roof. Now she stood surrounded by people who had quietly become her family. Months later, the first children entered the newly opened residence supported by the foundation. Above the entrance hung a small bronze plaque that read, "No child should ever wonder if kindness lasts until tomorrow." Visitors often admired the beautiful building without knowing the story behind those words. But Damien and Nia understood. They knew that the greatest legacy was never the empire that had survived a courtroom. It was the hope that would continue changing lives long after both of them were gone. Sometimes the strongest foundations are not built with money, influence, or power. Sometimes they begin with one umbrella shared in the rain, one open door, and one simple decision to believe that another human being is worth protecting. And on every Friday thereafter, fresh white lilies continued to appear beneath the portrait in the library, while somewhere else another frightened child walked through a welcoming doorway and discovered that kindness, when it is genuine, never truly ends. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who still believes that one act of compassion can change a lifetime.